The first time since the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, the word succession carried a weight of dread rather than destiny. And at the heart of it stood Princess Anne, the late Queen's only daughter, the steel spine of the monarchy, and perhaps the last royal who understood what duty truly meant. On October 17th, King Charles III issued 3 proclamations that would redefine the House of Windsor. In a single stroke, Prince Andrew and Prince Harry were removed from the line of succession. Prince William and Catherine were elevated as Crown Prince and Crown Princess, and Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, was denied a royal advisory post after direct objection from Princess Anne. The world saw a king consolidating power, but within the family, those close to Anne say she saw something else, a kingdom losing its center. She didn't see it as a family matter, a senior aide revealed. To her, this was about the survival of the crown itself, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Camilla, rewrite what her mother built. For Princess Anne, the monarchy was never about privilege. It was labor, repetition, service, a kind of sacred grind inherited from her mother. Over 20,000 royal engagements, no scandal, no complaint. She was the one constant through decades of chaos. When Charles ascended the throne, Anne had stood beside him not as an equal, but as an anchor. Yet, as the months unfolded, whispers began to ripple through the corridors. Camilla was reshaping the royal household, inserting loyalists, requesting unprecedented influence for her children. Anne had stayed silent, observing, calculating. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. The crown endures only when it stands above self. So when news reached her that Tom Parker Bowles was to be named a special advisor to the Crown Prince's office, Anne acted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't storm the king's chamber. She simply summoned her secretary and retrieved an envelope sealed years earlier the late queen's private instruction on succession integrity. Within hours, the plan was halted. Within days, the entire palace was whispering her name again. Insiders say Anne's decision wasn't emotional, it was constitutional. She viewed Camilla's ambitions as a threat not to the king, but to the monarchy's credibility. Her Majesty built this institution on discipline, one longtime equerry said. Anne sees herself as the last guardian of that discipline. She's not interested in titles, she's interested in order. Behind closed doors, Anne confronted her brother in what sources described as a measured but unyielding exchange. She spoke not as sister to brother, but as royal to sovereign. Her message was blunt. If you let personal sentiment guide your reign, you will lose the crown before you leave it. Charles listened and yielded. The following morning, the royal decrees were signed. That evening, Anne withdrew to Gatcombe Park, her private estate. No statements, no interviews, no photographs. But her absence spoke louder than her presence ever could. At Westminster, courtiers began to call her the Silent Queen, not for ambition, but for authority. She had no throne, no coronation, yet her word could still bend the arc of royal history. Meanwhile, Camilla's camp went quiet. Her public schedule was indefinitely suspended. Palace insiders described a cold civility between her and Anne, polite in public, icy in private. For Anne, the events of October 17 were not an end, but a beginning the quiet ignition of what insiders now call the hidden regency. She understood the truth before anyone else dared to say it. The king's health was faltering, the institution was fragile, and the crown needed structure before sentiment tore it apart. To some, she was ruthless. To others, she was righteous. But to Anne, it was simply her mother's legacy duty above desire. As one palace historian later wrote, if Elizabeth II built the fortress, Anne became its last sentry. Where others see a family, she sees a foundation. And when that foundation cracks, she repairs it not with words, but with will. The morning after the decrees were signed, Windsor Palace felt unnaturally still. The corridors, usually alive with the hum of staff, were hushed, as if the walls themselves knew that a line had been crossed. In one wing, the king's study door remained closed for hours. Inside, only 2 voices were heard, that of King Charles III and his sister, Princess Anne. Anne had requested no appointment. She simply walked into the study, the guards stepping aside with the same quiet respect they once showed their mother. Charles looked up from a stack of papers, his expression weary but proud. You've made your point, he said softly. Not yet, Anne replied. I've only begun to make sure you remember it. There was no shouting, no grand gesture. But witnesses later recalled the air around that room feeling heavy, as if the gravity of the crown itself was sitting between them. Anne began not with accusation, but with history. She reminded her brother that the monarchy's strength had never rested on affection, but on continuity. The late queen, she said, had endured storms of scandal because she refused to flinch. Charles, ever the philosopher king, countered that the modern monarchy needed compassion that times had changed. Anne's eyes hardened. Compassion is not the same as concession. When we start bending rules for family, the institution stops being royal, it becomes personal. And the personal destroys everything. Her words struck deeper than any headline. She was not questioning her brother's heart. She was questioning his compass. Then came her trump card. From her leather portfolio, she drew a folded sheet embossed with the late Queen's cipher ER2. It was part of the private correspondence of succession, sealed years before Elizabeth's passing. Anne placed it on Charles's desk without a word. The king unfolded it. The message was brief, written in his mother's unmistakable hand. If sentiment ever threatens duty, trust Anne to remind you of the oath you took, not as son, but as sovereign. Silence stretched. Charles closed his eyes, his shoulders collapsing beneath invisible weight. She always trusted you more than me, he murmured. No, Anne replied quietly. She trusted the duty in both of us. I just haven't forgotten what it sounds like. That exchange marked the true turning point. From that moment, palace insiders noted a subtle shift in royal rhythm. The king began delegating more to Prince William. Cabinet briefings were shortened. Foreign tours postponed. Behind the scenes, Anne assumed a new, unofficial portfolio: stabilization. She reviewed appointments, mediated disputes, and quietly removed those whose loyalties wavered. Her authority was nowhere in writing, yet everyone obeyed. Camilla's circle, however, saw something darker. One of her aides described Anne as a shadow regent, ruling through restraint. But Anne never sought the limelight. She kept to her creed: do the work, ignore the noise. By early November, whispers reached the corridors of Whitehall. Is Anne running the monarchy? Journalists asked under their breath. The palace dismissed the idea, yet evidence piled up. Key policy statements bore her phrasing. William's first major speech as crown prince quoted a line Anne had used decades earlier in New Zealand: to serve is to stay. Those who knew her said she didn't crave control. She feared collapse. The monarchy doesn't die in scandal, she once told a confidant. It dies in drift. In private, Charles came to depend on her steadiness. Late-night calls between Windsor and Gatcombe became frequent. She listened, offered counsel, and refused sympathy. He began to call her my compass. Yet beneath that renewed alliance lay a quiet sadness. Anne had sacrificed closeness for clarity. There was affection, yes, but it was measured, armored by duty. The two siblings, so different in temperament, now stood as reluctant co-architects of a fragile new era. A king learning restraint, and a sister ensuring he never forgot it. When Anne left the study that morning, she paused beneath the portrait of their mother. For a fleeting moment, staff saw her hand rest against the gilded frame. It's still your reign, Mama, she whispered. I'm just keeping the lights on. Outside, the October rain began to fall over Windsor's lawns, soft, persistent, unyielding. Much like the princess herself, by late autumn, the British monarchy had entered what historians would later describe as its quietest revolution. There were no abdications, no public ruptures, no press conferences. Yet within the polished corridors of Buckingham Palace, power had shifted not through decree, but through demeanor. And at the center of this invisible reordering stood Princess Anne. To those outside the palace gates, she remained the same. The practical princess, boots muddy from engagements, still shaking hands in forgotten counties. But behind the curt smiles and stoic posture, Anne had begun executing what one aide described as a quiet campaign for continuity. Her first move was subtle. She restructured the palace's internal reporting lines. Communications, finance, and ceremonial planning, once scattered between multiple offices, now all funneled indirectly through her private secretary, Sir Timothy Lawrence. Nothing left the palace without Anne's silent nod. She was building a firewall, said a senior courtier, not against the press, but against chaos. Camilla's household, still reeling from the October decrees, sensed their influence fading. Invitations once addressed to their majesties were quietly revised to the king. The queen's consort began canceling appearances, citing exhaustion. Meanwhile, Anne was seen more frequently alongside William and Catherine, not in grand events, but in working meetings, briefings, state preparations. Her message was clear. Continuity runs through the bloodline, not the marriage line. She began visiting royal estates, Sandringham, Balmoral, and Clarence House assessing staff morale, reviewing ledgers, even speaking to gardeners and cooks. She asked about duty, not loyalty, one staff member recalled. She wanted to know who still believed in the work. What emerged from those visits was a pattern of decay positions inherited through favoritism, budgets bloated by indulgence, and a growing gap between the crown and its subjects. Anne did not shout. She reorganized. Her guiding principle came from her mother's unwritten law: be seen when it matters, unseen when it doesn't. Anne applied it ruthlessly. Under her influence, the palace canceled several extravagant receptions and redirected funds toward veterans' hospitals and rural charities. Public perception shifted almost overnight. Approval ratings climbed not because of speeches, but because of silence that looked like sincerity. A political columnist wrote, "She has become the monarchy's conscience, a woman who rules without wanting to and serves without needing to be thanked." But within the palace, the cost of that discipline was mounting. Anne's growing role left Charles increasingly isolated. Advisors noticed fatigue in the king's demeanor, his health wavering under pressure. Yet he refused to rest. Perhaps pride, perhaps guilt. And Anne, ever the soldier, would not intervene emotionally. "Rest when the work is done," she told him once. He nodded, though both knew the work never truly ended. As the king weakened, three figures began shaping the future: Charles, William, and Anne. William was the face, young, diplomatic, modern. Charles remained the crown, cautious, contemplative. Anne was the force, invisible, immovable, indispensable. Together they formed what palace insiders called the Windsor Triangle. But triangles by nature contain tension. William respected his aunt, yet sometimes feared her severity. "She doesn't smile for cameras," he once joked privately. "She smiles for history." Anne saw in William both promise and peril, a man molded by media, not yet hardened by duty. So she began mentoring him quietly. Weekly lunches at Kensington Palace turned into lessons in legacy: how to command silence, how to endure criticism without reply, how to stand still while storms pass. She was preparing him, said one courtier, not to be king of hearts, but king of endurance. Through all this, Camilla remained a presence distant but defiant. Her friends whispered that Anne had usurped the emotional throne. "She's running a shadow court," Camilla confided to a biographer. "I married a king and ended up living in a monarchy run by his sister." Anne never responded. She understood that history remembers restraint more kindly than rebuttal. When the press speculated about a feud, her only statement was 5 words: "We all serve the same crown." But those who knew her best said the sentence held a hidden edge, a reminder that serving the crown didn't mean sharing it. By Christmas, the transformation was complete. Ceremonies were sharper, expenditures lower, morale higher. William and Catherine emerged as stable heirs apparent. The British public, weary of scandal, began to see in Anne the reflection of their late queen: stoic, dutiful, incorruptible. And yet, in the quiet of her private chapel at Gatcombe, Anne was said to pray not for victory, but for balance. She knew power, even in the service of duty, carries temptation. A former bishop who once served as her chaplain recalled her confession: "The hardest thing about holding a family together is remembering it isn't truly yours." Outside, the bells of St. George's Chapel tolled across the winter, air steady, deliberate, eternal. And so was she. In the weeks that followed, the explosive confrontation between Queen Camilla and Princess Anne, a strange quiet settled over Windsor. The tabloids called it a royal ceasefire. But inside the palace walls, silence was not peace, it was strategy. Princess Anne, ever the soldier, had withdrawn not in defeat, but in calculation. For decades, she had mastered the art of influence without noise. Now, as the monarchy teetered between transition and turmoil, she understood better than anyone that true power did not roar, it endured. Those close to Anne say she spent long nights in her private sitting room at Gatcombe Park, poring over correspondence, old family letters, and the Queen's private notes documents Elizabeth II had entrusted to her alone. Among them, one line stood out, written in the late Queen's familiar looping hand: "The monarchy must never become a mirror of personal ambition. It must remain the reflection of duty." To Anne, this was not sentiment, it was doctrine. It became her compass as she watched Camilla's increasing influence over royal affairs. The Queen consort's circle was tightening: loyal courtiers, media sympathizers, and a handful of senior aides who owed their promotions to her. Even the allocation of royal patronages, a domain once guided by the Queen's balance, had begun to tilt toward the Queen's household. Anne, however, played the long game. She refused to engage in public confrontation. Instead, she chose the field she knew best: service. Over the course of a month, she doubled her engagements, appearing in uniform at military bases, visiting agricultural fairs, and hosting veterans events. Each appearance carried a subtle message. This is what monarchy looks like: duty, not indulgence. Her quiet defiance did not go unnoticed. Within the corridors of Clarence's house, whispers began circulating that Anne was outshining the queen consort. One senior aide, speaking anonymously to the Telegraph, admitted that there's a growing perception that the Princess Royal represents the spirit of the late queen far more authentically than anyone else. Camilla, by contrast, faced growing scrutiny. The public was beginning to question the optics of her influence, particularly after a report surfaced that she had requested additional funding for personal projects tied to the Queen's Legacy Foundation. What should have been a harmless charity initiative was spun by the press into a narrative of self-interest, and the timing could not have been worse. When King Charles's health reportedly worsened, triggering a reduced public schedule, Camilla attempted to assume a more visible leadership role. But in doing so, she inadvertently crossed into sacred territory. A planned event to celebrate Women of the Crown at Buckingham Palace was suddenly cancelled without explanation. Insiders say it was Anne who intervened, warning that such an event would be in poor taste given the king's condition. The message was clear. Not all crowns are equal, and not all queens are beyond reproach. Behind the scenes, Anne's influence grew in unexpected ways. Senior palace officials, weary of factional tension, began to see her as the stabilizing anchor of the monarchy. She was consulted more frequently on ceremonial planning and succession logistics. Even Prince William, often careful to maintain neutrality, was said to have sought her counsel privately. Their conversations, though discreet, were crucial. William had inherited not just a title but a delicate moral burden, the future of the monarchy in a century that questioned its relevance. Anne, pragmatic as ever, reminded him that continuity was not about preservation, but adaptation. The crown doesn't survive because people worship it, she told him in one private exchange. It survives because people trust it. And trust comes from restraint, not spectacle. For William, those words became a guiding principle. For Camilla, they were a veiled warning. In the public eye, Anne remained impeccably composed. But those who knew her best sensed a quiet storm beneath the surface. She had been her mother's daughter in every sense, disciplined, stoic, and deeply private, but she was also her father's child, iron-willed, confrontational when pushed too far. There were moments when her frustration cracked through the veneer. During one engagement in Scotland, a journalist asked if she believed the monarchy was still united. Her response was measured but pointed. Unity, she said, isn't about everyone agreeing, it's about everyone remembering who they serve. The remark ricocheted across media outlets, dissected by royal analysts as a subtle jab at Camilla's growing assertiveness. But Anne made no clarifications, no denials. Silence, once again, became her shield. In the meantime, she began consolidating quiet alliances, staff loyal to her late mother, courtiers disillusioned with palace politics, and even members of the Commonwealth who had long admired her unpretentious approach. One ambassador described her as the monarchy's last unbreakable thread. And perhaps that was true, for while others fought for crowns and titles, Anne fought for something far more fragile, the soul of the institution itself. By late autumn, her influence had reshaped the palace's internal rhythm. Schedules were reviewed, expenditures scrutinized, and all senior correspondence now required oversight from the Lord Chamberlain, a process Anne herself had quietly recommended. It was not rebellion, it was restoration. And as winter approached, a chill far greater than the weather descended upon Buckingham Palace. The king's health was waning, public trust was fracturing, and the line between duty and desire blurred dangerously thin. Through it all, Princess Anne stood unmoved, a solitary sentinel in a crumbling fortress of tradition. Her silence spoke louder than any proclamation. It was the silence of a woman who had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and knew that the true measure of royalty was not in the wearing of a crown, but in the refusal to betray its weight. Winter descended over Britain with a heaviness that mirrored the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace. King Charles's public appearances grew fewer, his frailty increasingly evident. The monarchy, an institution built on continuity, now found itself at an uncomfortable crossroads. For the first time in decades, the question whispered through the halls of Windsor was not what comes next, but who truly leads now. At the center of that question stood two women, Queen Camilla and Princess Anne. By late December, Camilla had begun assuming informal control over many of the king's household decisions. Officially, it was under the guise of support. Unofficially, it was power subtle, expanding, and deliberate. She had begun meeting weekly with the Privy Council, signing correspondence, and even influencing the royal schedule. To outsiders, it was the mark of a dutiful consort. To insiders, it was the beginning of a quiet consolidation. Anne saw the shift clearly. To her, the monarchy's danger was not just in illness or instability, it was in the corrosion of purpose. For months, she had watched Camilla transform from supportive spouse to de facto regent. There were discussions about restructuring the public image of the monarchy, introducing modern partnerships and representation, blurring lines between personal and official influence. It was the very thing her mother had spent 70 years preventing. One evening at Sandringham, during what should have been a quiet family gathering, tensions finally broke the surface. Camilla, seated at the king's right, had proposed a new initiative, the Queen's Legacy Program, designed to celebrate the modern feminine face of monarchy. To many, it sounded noble. To Anne, it sounded dangerously self-serving. She spoke softly, yet every word carried the sharpness of command. The monarchy doesn't need a new face, Camilla. It needs a steady hand. Ah? The table fell silent. Charles, pale and tired, looked down at his plate. William's eyes shifted between the two women, his aunt's composure, his stepmother's tightening jaw. It was a rare, unscripted fracture in the royal facade. In the days that followed, rumors swirled. Sources close to the Princess Royal described her as deeply concerned about the erosion of constitutional protocol. For Anne, this was not about personal dislike or rivalry, it was about duty. The monarchy, she believed, must never serve as a platform for individual ambition. Behind the scenes, Anne began working quietly with senior palace advisors. She sought to reinforce a clearer distinction between the king's office and the queen's household. Documents were drafted to ensure that all official communications required co-signature from the private secretary, not Camilla's staff. It was bureaucracy, yes, but also protection. When the king was hospitalized briefly for what the palace called a routine assessment, the nation's eyes turned to the family. Camilla was photographed entering the hospital with her usual poise. Anne, however, arrived unannounced alone, wearing her military coat, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. She stayed inside for hours, emerging without a word. A nurse later described her visit as quiet, firm, almost military. She checked on staff, reviewed her brother's condition, and ensured the press area remained sealed. It was like she was commanding a ship, the nurse said. You could tell she was the only one keeping order. That image, Anne, the soldier princess guarding the heart of the monarchy, resonated deeply with the public. Newspapers began to print subtle contrasts between the two women, Camilla the consort versus Anne the guardian. Polls showed a spike in Anne's popularity. She had become, almost unintentionally, the moral compass of the crown. Camilla noticed. In early January, the queen consort reportedly held a private meeting with senior press officers, instructing them to rebalance coverage and emphasize her contributions. A new round of articles appeared, portraying her as the pillar of compassion behind the ailing king. Yet even in carefully managed narratives, something had shifted. The people were looking to Anne for assurance, not Camilla. Meanwhile, within palace walls, Anne's counsel grew decisive. She advised William on key ceremonial preparations and worked closely with senior courtiers to stabilize the monarchy's internal structure. Her approach was not glamorous, not televised, but effective. She was restoring the crown from within. Those close to her said she often quoted one of her mother's private maxims: "The moment we seek admiration, we stop deserving it." It was the creed guiding her every move. But there was a cost. Behind her stoic demeanor, Anne carried the weight of isolation. She knew that opposing the queen consort, even indirectly, risked being labeled divisive. Yet, for her, silence in the face of erosion was the greater betrayal. Then came the moment that defined her stance forever. During a televised Commonwealth address, one originally planned for Camilla, Anne appeared unexpectedly, delivering a brief but piercing statement on behalf of the crown. She spoke of continuity, restraint, and service before self. The subtext was unmistakable. The public hailed it as a speech of reassurance. The palace called it a family decision. But behind closed doors, it was anything but. Camilla was reportedly furious, interpreting Anne's move as a direct challenge to her authority. The two women did not speak for weeks afterward. Yet within the ancient system of British royalty, history has always favored the one who acts, not the one who reacts. Anne's quiet defiance had redefined the monarchy's center of gravity. In an institution built on ritual, she had restored substance. By late February, even some of Camilla's longtime allies began to shift allegiance. The queen consort's charm no longer shielded her from scrutiny. Meanwhile, Anne's reputation solidified not as the rebel, but as the regent the nation trusted, even if unofficially. Inside Windsor's stone walls, the air was heavy with unspoken truths. The king's strength was fading. The crown's balance was delicate. And amid the cold, one woman dressed in uniform, her medals gleaming faintly in the winter light, stood alone against the shadows of Windsor. She was not seeking a throne, she was protecting its meaning. The dawn that broke over Windsor was thin and cold. the kind of English morning where light feels more like memory than hope. Inside the private chapel, Princess Anne stood motionless before the altar, her gloved hands clasped, her face unreadable. Behind her, faint organ notes drifted through the air, solemn, reverent, almost mournful. King Charles had taken a turn for the worse. The palace's official statement used familiar words, resting comfortably, routine monitoring, but the truth was quietly circulating through senior staff. The king was not expected to recover fully, and as reality settled, the centuries-old question of continuity rose again. In the corridors of power, Camilla moved swiftly. Meetings were called, papers reviewed, preparations whispered. The Queen Consort's team believed this was her moment to step into the light, to secure her place as Britain's stabilizing presence. But across the same palace grounds, Anne was charting a different course. She was not planning for power, she was preparing for legacy. In a private audience with Archbishop Welby, Anne made her position clear. If the crown is to survive, it must return to its principal service before sovereignty. Her words were not rebellion, but a reaffirmation of the monarchy's oldest oath. It was then that she made what those close to her later called the final vow. "When my brother can no longer carry the crown," she said quietly, "I will not let it be carried by ambition. It must rest in duty, even if it costs me everything." The archbishop reportedly nodded, visibly moved. It was not an oath taken for public eyes, not sealed by ceremony, but by conviction. In the days that followed, Anne's actions spoke louder than any decree. She oversaw the king's schedule, ensured his privacy, and carefully managed the press so that no photograph of frailty would humiliate the monarch. Every detail from the king's medical statements to his final public image bore her discreet, disciplined touch. Meanwhile, Camilla's public appearances increased, though her confidence had begun to waver. Public opinion, once sympathetic, had turned wary. Headlines praised the steadfast Princess Royal, while editorials questioned whether royal service has found its true successor in Anne, not in titles but in spirit. For Anne, it was never a contest, it was duty. When the king eventually retreated to Balmoral for rest, Anne accompanied him quietly. Those present recalled her constant presence not as a grieving sister, but as a watchful guardian. She was the first to arrive each morning, last to leave each night, ensuring every detail ran as her mother would have wished. It was during one of those long nights, as snow blanketed the Scottish hills, that the king, weary but lucid, looked at her and said softly, "You've always understood, Anne, the monarchy isn't ours, we only borrow it." She didn't reply. She only nodded the same nod she had given to her mother so many years before, when Elizabeth II had handed her the burden of continuity. Weeks later, when the inevitable announcement came, the king's passing in his sleep, the world turned its eyes once again to Windsor. Amid tears, tributes, and televised ceremonies, Anne moved like a ghost of tradition, precise, unwavering, steel beneath silence. Camilla stood beside the new King William, her expression a studied blend of grief and grace. But for the first time, it was clear. The power in that moment did not belong to the Queen Dowager, nor even to the new monarch. It belonged to Anne, the sister who had held the line, the woman who had preserved the crown when politics threatened to consume it. As the bells tolled and the Union Jack lowered, Anne remained outside the chapel long after others had gone. Alone under the gray sky, she whispered words only the wind would carry. "You trusted me, Mama. I kept it safe." And with that, she turned and walked away, not toward the cameras, not toward applause, but toward the quiet work that had always defined her life. The monarchy had entered a new chapter, reshaped not by ambition, but by endurance. And somewhere within the cold stone heart of Windsor, the legacy of Queen Elizabeth lived on, not through power, not through crowns, but through a daughter's vow kept in silence. Princess Anne, the last sentinel of duty, had fulfilled her promise.